Welcome to Unit 3, Art as Cultural Heritage, Lesson 16, The Classical and Medieval West. Historically, art was produced for the glorification of a deity, to honor a monarch, and as a means of education or communication. The contributions that came from Greece and Rome are explored, as well as the impact Christianity had in early Christian, Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic times. The objectives for this lesson are to explain the artistic and architectural innovations of ancient Greece and Rome, relate the characteristics of classical art to Greek and Roman cultural values, identify architectural elements that characterize classical and medieval structures, discuss the influence of Christianity on art and society in medieval Europe, distinguish visual characteristics of early Christian, Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic art, and compare different ways artists communicate sacred or religious ideas through art. The outline for this lesson, the subjects we'll be covering are Greece, Rome, early Christian and Byzantine art, the Middle Ages in Europe, early medieval art, Romanesque, and Gothic art. We'll start this lesson by looking at the art of ancient Greece. When trying to understand the art of the ancient Greeks, one must also get an understanding of the mindset of the people of the time. The ancient Greeks believed fully in human potential. Their mythology reflected this, in that the humans or mortals represented people of superhuman strength, ones with godlike characteristics, and the gods or deities in their mythology had more of an aspect of human weaknesses. That was their downfall. The most well-known ancient philosophers, such as Plato and Socrates, also came from Greece, and they contributed to the mindset as well as reflected the mindset of the people of the time. What we're looking at in this image is the Euphroneus crater. It's from around 515 BCE. A crater is a reference to the shape of this object. It's got handles on it. It was a ceremonial drink mixing bowl. The painting style is typical of the ancient Greeks. It's also considered an archaic style, meaning that it's at the roots of where the artistic style of the Greeks came from, which was also influenced by the art of Mesopotamia. This image is of an ancient Greek statue of a standing male youth. Male youth is koros in Greek. Kore, K-O-R-E, is female youth in Greek. This is from around 580 BCE. When we discuss art all throughout this course, but especially in these last two units, we'll be talking about the influences that certain cultures had on one another, either through their religion or through their artistic styles. This statue is an example of Egyptian influence on Greek sculpture. There's heavy rigidity in the way the youth is standing. Its posture is even on each side, except for the legs, but it's not in any way weighted any differently on either side of the body. It's very stiff. This is heavily influenced by Egyptian sculpture. We've looked at examples that are similar in posturing as to this. The reason why we're talking about this is the next image we'll be looking at deals with the Greek breakaway in posturing, which is called contrapposto. In art history, when a piece of art is referred to as classical, it usually means that it has roots in ancient Greek and ancient Roman cultures. We're going to have several revivals throughout art history that go back to these original ideals, and there's some substance behind it because the early Greek artists, as well as some of the Renaissance artists that were responsible for bringing about the second revival of Greek classical ideas, they were obsessed with proportions and the math behind the human form. This slide that we're looking at is a Roman copy of a Greek original. Unfortunately, many pieces were destroyed or couldn't withstand the test of time. Luckily, the first classical revival that the Romans participated in, they were able to at least preserve in copies some of the original Greek sculptures. This is the spear bearer by Polykleitos of Argos. It's a prime example of the human form being perfect proportion. That's something that Polykleitos wrote a treatise about. Treatises are basically a statement from an artist. In modern times we call it an artist statement. It's usually the reasoning and the thoughts going into a particular body or a piece of work. Sometimes in modern times when larger groups of people write these, they're called manifestos. When it's more of an art movement rather than an opinion or basically a layout of plans from a particular artist. This sculpture is also an example of where Polykleitos and possibly other sculptors broke away from the Egyptian styling that we saw in the previous slide of the Koros, to where it doesn't have that rigid frontward posture. This is an example of a more natural posture in this sculpture. It's called contrapposto. It's counterpoise, basically, where the weight is more on one leg and it's balanced with the other side of the body. This is a common pose by humankind, and Polykleitos recognized it and incorporated it into his work, and it became commonplace afterwards for representing the human form. In the previous slide, I had mentioned harmonic ratios. Harmonic ratios did not only exist in the examples of the human form, it was something that was perceived to be beyond just the manifestation of mankind, that you could translate this into architecture as well. Later on in cathedral architecture, harmonic ratios are also used to get perfect acoustics. Remember, in the old times when cathedrals being built, there wasn't necessarily any microphone to carry the voices, so the way a structure is built enhances the echo or the way a voice can be transferred. But it's a little different with something like this in the Parthenon, where it's more size relationships, that it's the ratio of 4 to 9. When you start to dig this apart, it gets very mathematical. It starts getting into pi territory, where a lot of these harmonic ratios can be continued infinitely, meaning that they can be divided unto themselves. It's a very interesting concept. It also has its root in elliptical spirals, and something that is visible in all forms of nature, in storm clouds, in draining water, the nautilus shell, many different examples, but we can go on for hours about the harmonic ratios. Another thing Greek architects understood was optics, and it's the effect sometimes when we look at certain structures that there's an optical illusion that they may bend or not be in a perfect line. So something that's in the Parthenon is something called an antithesis, which is a slight little imperceptible bulge. It is perceivable, of course, by math, but not very perceivable by the eye. It's a slight bulge to correct any of this kind of bending visually, optically, of when you look up from the bottom, say, at the top of the structure. This antithesis tends to add a little bit of a curve, but it makes things look straighter when we view it from below. In this slide, we have another view of the Parthenon. It's from further away, from the southwest. Today, modern Greeks are attempting to do some repair work to the Parthenon, and the antithesis point that I brought up before causes a little bit of difficulty, since there are no original mathematical designs or layouts for the Parthenon available for the modern engineers and architects to work with it to restructure and bring some more support back to the building. But they have to add this antithesis point, and it's more a little bit by trial and error, and of course some math in there, to get these columns reconstructed to basically fit in and prevent the building from degrading anymore. Their intention is not to completely rebuild it, just to keep it in a more of a safer zone so it can be preserved for later generations. Also, one thing to note is originally in the Parthenon there was a giant statue. The statue was of the Greek goddess Athena. Athena's full reference name was Athena of Parthenos, and that is where the Parthenon gets its name. The gigantic sculpture has been gone for many centuries, and there really is no other reference other than there was some type of written record given that it was in the interior at one time. The original Parthenon was adorned with many sculptural treatments. We have friezes and something called metopes, which this is an example of. Metopes are these square panels that are spaced evenly across. There's usually some type of narrative or elements of Greek mythology, classical tales, being told through sculptural elements. This particular metope is of the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs. As you see, many of the components of it have broken off over time, and there really aren't many examples of these in perfect condition. This sculpture is of the three goddesses. It is a pediment sculpture from the Parthenon in Athens. From around 438 to 432 BCE, the slide is a part of your chapter focus, which brings up a different aspect of the history of the Parthenon. It's more what happened to it after the fact. Greece was under foreign control, foreign dominance for many, many years, and a lot of its artifacts wound up disappearing and winding up in museums in other countries. This particular one is in England, and there's still a type of battle going on between the Greek and the British governments about who this actually belongs to. The Greeks, of course, feel it's a part of their history. The British government, in speaking about it, say that it's available to be viewed by all of mankind for free at a museum in proper conditions. Now there is a museum dealing directly with the portions of the Parthenon that could be exhibited, various friezes, sculptures, reliefs, and other things. And they say now that they can house this in Greece, but the British are still hanging on to it. In ancient Greek architecture, there's somewhat of an evolution in design, and because of this, we can kind of categorize certain Greek structures in particular time periods. The first one we're going to be looking at is on the left. This is the Doric architectural order. This is the design that is in the Parthenon that we just looked at. The architectural orders deal with mostly the post and beam aspect of the structure, so you can identify certain aspects of it and associate with it a certain time period. In the Doric, there is no base. There is a column, which is called a shaft. If you notice, it's a little wider towards the bottom and thinner at the top. At the top of the shaft, you have a capital. Above the capital, which is on the beam area of the structure, is the architrave, and then above that you have a frieze. A frieze area is normally decorated in ancient times with relief sculptures and other things that are assembled and put on top of there in panels, similar to the metopes that we looked at. Also, next to the Doric order, we have the Ionic order, which comes a little bit later in time. In this particular order, we have a base, which is not in the Doric order. We have a shaft that is not tapered like in the Doric order, so immediately between those two you can differentiate them. At the top of the shaft, the capital is much more decorative and not as functional in a sense, as the Doric. The architrave above that and the frieze are going to be similar to the next architectural order, which is Corinthian. On the Corinthian base, a little elaboration on the design. There's also a shaft here as well, slightly thinner than the Ionic and Doric orders. At the top of the Corinthian shaft, you will see a extremely decorative capital. As these evolved, more and more decoration was added to these. Above that, the architrave is fairly similar to the Ionic order, and the frieze area is similar to the Ionic order as well. Greek sculpture slowly drifted away from being noble and idealistic and took on more sensual, sometimes erotic characteristics. This is yet another Roman copy of an ancient Greek sculpture. It's the Venus de Medici. The sculptor of the original work was Praxiteles. This is also quite a change for Greek sculpture that is now representing the female nude, which is relatively unknown before this piece. This established the ideal of the female form for centuries to come, all the way up to the Renaissance, which was a classic revival as well. They went back to the ancient Greeks and Romans to get some of their concepts and ideas for how to represent the human form. This slide is of a sculpture titled the Laocoon Group. It is a Roman copy of a 1st or 2nd century BCE Greek sculpture. After the decline of the Greek city-states, the art had also changed, became less ideal, and had a little bit more of a emotional aspect to it, meaning that the figures in some way are telling some type of story through the expressions on their physical forms and on their faces. The sculptures that came in this period of time after the decline of the Greek city-states are called Hellenistic, which means Greek-like. The characters in this sculpture are from a Greek mythological tale. Laocoon was a Trojan priest who warned of the acceptance of the now infamous Trojan horse. The next major civilization to rise after Greece is that of Rome. The Romans, as a society, didn't focus in their art as much on the noble and ideal as the ancient Greeks did, even though they were heavily inspired by the ancient Greeks in philosophy as well as their art. This particular sculpture, which is from an unknown artist, it's the portrait head of an old man, exemplifies the Roman tendency to represent people as individuals. We have wrinkles and warts and all, as your text put it, approach to the sculpting of the face in here, which doesn't show the ideal as much. It shows how the humans can gain basic characteristics that exemplify them as originals. This also goes beyond, of course, to behavior, but even the way we're physically represented. We are individuals by the way our hair is, by the way our wrinkles are, whatever moles or other features we might have that differentiate us from others. The Romans tended to exemplify this in their work. More than their sculpture, the Romans' greatest artistic achievements were in architecture, town planning, and civil engineering. Civil engineering and town planning being the construction of streets, public restrooms, and flowing water and plumbing. One example of their achievement in architecture is what is left of the Roman Colosseum, which was built around 70 to 80 CE, which is on the modern side of our time periods. CE is the common replacement for AD in reference to time periods. if you were alive at the time where the Colosseum was in full swing, you would have been able to see gladiator battles, major hunts with wild game, and they were also able to flood the Colosseum and have mock sea battles in there as well. The next example of Roman architecture we'll be looking at is the Pantheon. The Parthenon was built originally as a temple for all of the gods to be worshipped. The large area up front that you see with the columns is called a portico, which is a covered porch. This slide is a diagram of the Pantheon in Rome. On top we have the plan, which is basically the architectural layout of the Pantheon, and below we have a cross section which allows us more of a cross view to look at it from the side. If you look at the section on the bottom, you can see the representation of the dome on top. What's a little bit more interesting is that the Pantheon is laid out almost as a globe, a large spherical interior. Even though the walls don't necessarily represent it, you can see in the section that it's laid out that way. Also to the left in the section portion of the diagram, you can see the portico as well. The slide is a painting by Giovanni Paolo Panini. It's what the interior of the Pantheon Rome looked like in 1734. Already by this point, there is no more gold on the top dome area on the interior as there once was. There are also some architectural features to point out. The little square-like features that are on the interior of the dome are called coffers. They lighten the visual weight of the dome, but they also strengthen the dome physically. Also at the top, the opening that you can see the sky through that provides the actual light on the interior of the Pantheon is called an oculus. This slide is a photograph I took of the interior of the Pantheon showing the oculus. What's very interesting about this is that it was raining outside this particular day, and even though the opening was there, I guess it was just angled in such a way that you could walk on the interior and there wasn't any rain on the ground below. These are two photographs that I took as well. In the upper left, I took this photograph from under the porch area of the McDonald's located right in front of the Pantheon. I thought it was completely ridiculous that a McDonald's was located right there. It's a prime example of how modern civilization is encroaching upon our ancient structures. As a matter of fact, as you come upon the Pantheon in modern times, you'll be walking down the street. It was very hard to find on a map because you couldn't really see around the corner because of those large apartment buildings that you see to the left or right. And then you just turn the corner and there's this glorious giant building. I also took a slide of the front of the glass of the McDonald's front door. On the interior, it was quite humorous as well. I didn't take any photos of it, but there were very old-looking, trying to emulate fresco-style paintings on the inside of ancient Roman life. It was very humorous to experience this. One thing to remember about ancient Rome is that it was an empire and it had its tentacles spread across Europe and into the east, as well as up to the north, extending beyond the continental Europe and going into England as well. So even though this is considered a Roman painting, it was actually located in the city of Pompeii, which was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius when it erupted in 79 CE. In this painting, you can see the early beginnings of artists attempting to give some type of perspective to their work. Of course, it's all over the place and incorrect, but it's using an early form of mathematically trying to lay out structures. It's a very fine attempt, but it takes many centuries for that technique to evolve. Some of the old tales about Pompeii were that it was a decadent city, and that's why it incurred the wrath of Mount Vesuvius. When we look at these pictures that I took when I got to go to Pompeii, they're still upkeeping the grounds, but there were lavish villas, as we saw an exterior painting of in the previous slide. Here are some interiors from some of the different villas that were in the area by the richer people that lived in Pompeii. Pompeii was a very diverse city. You could get a little bit of everything there. There were many houses of prostitution gearing towards any type of interest that people may have had. Also, the most famous mosaic of Alexander the Great was also found at Pompeii. Pompeii was covered with volcanic ash and mud. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, I have an example. This was a covered area in Pompeii. If you looked over the back of you could actually see the ominous view of Mount Vesuvius in the background. Most of the people died in their sleep. As you can see here, they were all laying in their beds. There are other images of people that may have experienced a lot more terror in the process of the volcano erupting, in the sense that they weren't covered immediately and they may have tried to escape. And you'll find some of these castings of human forms by the volcanic ash showing people in expressions of pain, as unfortunately as they were dying. This map is of Europe from 117 to 400. It also covers many of the locations of the art that we'll be looking at and that we have looked at in this lesson. The next subjects we'll be covering are early Christian and Byzantine art. Early Christians were not able to worship publicly, so they had the tendency to show their worship through paintings exhibited in their private homes that were out of the public eye, or in underground burial areas called catacombs that they created to give some dignity to their dead. This example here is an early Christian fresco. It's of Christ and the apostles. One thing to note in here is that this painting also uses the tradition of hierarchical scale, meaning that Christ is the largest person represented, even though he wasn't any larger than the people surrounding him. Another important note is how time sometimes is reflected in our representations of Jesus. Our modern representation of him is of a white man with a beard and a mustache. In early Roman times, he was represented in what they recognized as modern-day dress and such of the Romans, and he does not have a beard or a mustache in this image either. Christians were finally able to worship publicly in the year 313. That was when Emperor Constantine finally acknowledged Christianity. In this slide here we have a sculpture of the head of Emperor Constantine from around 312 CE. Emperor Constantine was not only responsible for the modern spreading in the public fashion of Christianity, but he also sponsored a major public works projects to bring worship to the public, to the common man. This is an example of a drawing. It's a reconstruction of the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Under Constantine's rule, the Christians adapted the public meeting halls that were the basilicas into public places of worship. These are the predecessors of the modern-day church. This slide is an old painting. It's the interior view of the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This diagram is a plan for the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In the original Roman basilica where you see the word nave on the left-hand side of this diagram, that originally was a long central aisle. Nave is traditional. What that central aisle is called now in a church. At the end of that particular aisle was an apse. The apse was originally where government bodies and law courts met. In the year 404, the Roman emperor decided to move the capital of Rome to the city of Ravenna, Italy, which is about 80 miles south of the city of Venice. He did this in particular to try to ward off the invading Germanic armies that were plundering Italy at the time. This slide is of the church at San Vitale. It's a Byzantine church built between 526 and 547. This diagram is a plan for the San Vitale Byzantine Church in Ravenna, Italy. As an architectural structure, this is very important in the development of churches, but what's really important about San Vitale are the treasures, the artistic treasures that are inside the church. This is a detail of a mosaic from the interior of the San Vitale Basilican Church in Ravenna, Italy. Christian artists perfected the art of mosaic, which was a long-standing tradition, but the older versions used larger portions of tesserae, which are broken pieces of glass and marble. As a matter of fact, the Christian artists focused more on the glass aspects of the tesserae, which tended to have a lot more illumination when light reflected off of the surface of the mosaics. The entire mosaic shows images of religious events and religious figures, as well as that of Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, who is pictured here. Notice how she has a halo around her head, somehow equivocating her with Mary and Jesus. This slide is also of a mosaic from the interior of the San Vitale Church in Ravenna, Italy. It is an apse mosaic. It's in the apse area above the altar. Remember, the apse originally was the area where government officials and law bodies met in earlier times of the Roman Basilica before the church kind of took over the principal design of this. Also, if you look in the center of the mosaic, we see a representation of Jesus, which is still in Roman garb. The traditional Jesus that we see bearded and emaciated has not exactly come into the picture yet. Christ as Pantocrator with Mary and saints is another example of an apse mosaic. This is also from a Byzantine church. It's the Cathedral of Monreale, Sicily. It was made in the late 12th century, so much later than what we saw before. Yet another example of the tradition carrying on. And also, if you look at the portrait of Jesus, you can also see that he is bearing a beard by this point. I'm sure most of you have heard of the term icon before. In our modern times, it mostly gets used in the context of talking about celebrities that have passed on, say with music, someone like Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, and in the area of movies, people like Marilyn Monroe and James Dean have risen to icon status. In the context of Christian art, an icon is a small devotional painting. The painting itself is intended to inspire one to worship, but not to be worshipped itself. This, of course, has caused a complex relationship with the church, which now it's fully accepted in our Western form of Christianity. But in the past, the church has dealt with icons in a very harsh fashion. When the church tried to crack down on the creation of icon paintings, it created a little subcategory of person called a iconoclast. It's a image breaker, someone who destroys an icon. This image here is the icon of the Old Testament Trinity from around 1410. It's by Andrei Rublev. This is on the larger side of an icon painting. A lot of them were made to be a little bit more portable than this one being 55.5 by 44.5 inches. A lot of early icon paintings were made with precious materials, be it valuable pigments from far-off lands or gold leafing, as we see in this icon painting from the Byzantine school. It's Madonna and Child on a curved throne from around the 13th century. These paintings used finer materials to make a further connection with God just by being the best of what was available. At the center of this painting, we have an image of Mary and the baby Jesus, looking slightly wise there, but this is a lot different than some other paintings. There's a symbolic nature to the throne that she's sitting on, that she's referred to as the Queen of the City of Heaven. Next, we're going to look at the Middle Ages in Europe. The Middle Ages fall roughly between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. The Middle Ages in Europe can be subdivided into a few subcategories, the first of which we'll be going over is early medieval art. This is an example of early nomadic art that's from the 5th to 3rd century. It's a round tray on conical stand. This is just an example of the type of art that the nomads would carry with them throughout their journeys in Europe, and this is the type of art that would spread to the cultures that they became involved with, and this, of course, essentially describes a lot of the style of the art that's being made in Europe in these early medieval times. Even though what we see here is much older, the art didn't really necessarily evolve very much with the nomads. The Greeks often referred to the nomadic tribes as barbarians. This purse cover once belonged to a East Anglian king from the 7th century. It is from the Sutton Hoo ship burial at Suffolk, England. It was made before 655. There are two human figures that are on the left and right hand side of the lower part of the purse underneath the designs. They are flanked each by two animals. This design motif has its roots in ancient Sumerian art. This is a page from the Book of Kells from the late 8th century. This is called the Chi Rho monogram. It's based off of XP, which are the two first letters of Christ in the Greek alphabet. This is art from something called an illuminated manuscript, which is a religious text that is decorated in such a fashion as we see here. Originally, the writing used for this started off as small little decorative letters, and eventually the letters that open a certain particular book or phrase can dominate a whole entire page in this style of art. This is made of ink and pigments on vellum. Vellum, many centuries ago, was either made from the skin of calves or from sheep. The next style of art we'll be going over from the Middle Ages is Romanesque. The only Romanesque work we'll be looking at is this sculpture made of stone from the St. Madeleine Cathedral in Vézelay, France. It's Christ of the Pentecost. The use of hierarchical scale in Christian art was pretty prevalent up until the Renaissance period. As you can see in this sculpture, Christ is at least twice as large as the apostles next to him. Romanesque is the term used to describe art made between the mid-11th century and the mid-12th century. It was used originally to describe mostly the architecture from this period, but now all art made in this period is referred to as Romanesque. The last style of art we'll be going over from the Middle Ages is Gothic. We've already looked at this cathedral before in our lesson on architecture. Here are two different views of the Notre Dame de Chartres in Chartres, France. The view on the upper left is from the southeast. On the right we have the west front view. This is the quintessential work of Gothic architecture. If you look at the back of the cathedral, you can see the flying buttresses there for support. Also the super spiring towers that are typical of Gothic cathedrals are also there. Back in these times, of course, assembling a church like this would have taken quite a long time with the amount of labor that was available and the complexity of what they were doing, and also not having the use of modern-day equipment. Even Gothic architecture had its phases. If you look at the west front on the right, you can see the transition in styles evident in the front facade of the cathedral. When you look at the two towers at the front of the building, on the right-hand side, we have the original tower as it was intended. On the left-hand side, the north tower was rebuilt after the original tower had collapsed. In the transition from early to late Gothic, the architecture tends to rise higher and higher and higher towards the heavens, trying to build a larger interior space with larger stained glass windows to let in more and more light. Technically, even when you go in there in modern times, it's still fairly dark on the inside. This photograph is from the interior of the cathedral. It is of the north rose window. It's called the Rose de France window. A rose window uses geometric patterns in its complex design. These designs were intended to be elaborate and chock full of information. One thing to remember is during this time period, most of the general public was illiterate, and the best way to explain biblical stories was through imagery such as this. These are massive. They basically are almost like projected images on the screen from the amount of light coming from the outside. This set of sculptures is on the west side of the cathedral. They are located to the right of the center door on that side. They are Old Testament prophet, kings, and queen from around 1145 to 1170. These are prime examples of early Gothic sculpture. They have elongated features. They are stoic in nature and non-flamboyant like some of the art from the late Gothic was. The presence of kings and a queen on here are intended to somehow suggest that Christ had royal heritage. This, of course, also ties them in with the French monarchy. The last slide we'll be looking at for this lecture is a plan diagram from the cathedral. This plan was based on the Latin cross. It's important to point out the Latin cross because that is closer to what we're familiar with as the cross today, which is a long center with a shorter bar in the middle. The earliest Christian crosses were more of a plus sign than what we're used to today. It's not really evident that this design is laying underneath everything because of all the elaborate decoration and structural elements that kind of mask this. Of course, you need more of an aerial view to pick up on this a lot more, and the people of the time were not able to do that. So, thank you very much for listening.